behalf of the team, I'd like to welcome you all to this year's 3CT Laurent Berland Graduate Conference, Power and Personality in Contemporary Capitalism. We had 3 amazing panels today, and we have 2 upcoming tomorrow. If you weren't there, we expect you tomorrow. And in addition to a roundtable at the very end tomorrow. Additionally, at the end of this keynote, there will be a reception downstairs, and please do attend. So our keynote, I want to introduce our keynote. Professor Cédric Durand is a professor of political economy at the University of Geneva and a member of the Centre d'Économie Paris-Nord, working in the Marxist and French Regulationist traditions. His research explores the transformations of contemporary capitalism, focusing on globalization, financialization, intellectual monopolization, and the prospects for ecological planning and an eco-socialist transition. He is the author of Fictitious Capital, How Finance Appropriates Our Future, and Techno-Feudalism, The Making of the Digital Economy, both with Warsaw as well as with Razmik Kocheyan, Le Principe de la Planification Écologique. His articles have appeared in leading journals, including World Development, the Review of International Political Economy, the Cambridge Journal of Economics, and the Socioeconomic Review. Durand is also a regular contributor to Contretemps, Sidecar, and the New Left Review. So let's welcome Professor Durand.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for having me. Thank you very much for this very generous introduction. I'm very happy to be here, to hear all the panels today, and to be able to present some ideas tonight. So this is a new project, a new book project that I'm just beginning with. And you will see it's very structuralist and French, so it's kind of a little bit old school, but I hope that you will still enjoy it. So the title of the presentation is The Vacant Throne, Institutional Contest for Dominance After the Hegemony of Finance. And I would like to begin by this idea developed by Jameson following on Althusser, the idea that we need some forms of cognitive mapping. Some form of cognitive mapping. Here we have the old Althusserian idea that what is represented in ideology is the imaginary relation of the individuals to the real relation in which they live. And so this cognitive mapping is something that enables us to get a form of situational representation and to be able to locate us in the vaster and properly unrepresentable totality. So we need that as a proxy to the world we are living in, if you want. And the lack of mapping is a big problem, is a big issue. And here Jameson is relying on the work of Kevin Lynch, the image of the city, where Lynch said that the alienated city is above all a space in which people are unable to map in their minds either their own position or the relevant totality. And Jameson was in fact pointing out the fact that postmodern condition is a condition where cognitive mapping is problematic. He said that the postmodern hyperspace has succeeded in transforming the capacity of the individual human body to locate itself, to organize its immediate surroundings perceptually and cognitively to map its position. So, in other words, we are looking for cognitive mapping. We are missing some forms of cognitive mapping. What we need, according to Jameson again, is some mode of representing the world in which we may again begin to grasp our positioning both as individual and as collective subject, and to regain through this mapping the capacity to act. So in this presentation, I would like to try to engage this issue of how could we get back this ability to map, what kind of or lack of cognitive mapping do prevailing economic paradigm provide. So that's the point of departure. How could we get through the regulationist perspective an alternative to this lack of mapping, and rapidly what kind of research questions should we ask? So a lot of frustration because there will be not a lot of results, but a lot of questions I get. So the outline of the presentation is the following one. First, I will propose you some stylus facts to delineate what is, in my view, the conjuncture, how we can engage with that conjuncture. And then we will discuss how we lost some form of agency in neoliberal theories. Then I will try to address the issue of the polycrisis, the issue of the polycrisis being symptomatic of this lack of mapping capability, but this desire, some forms of totality. And finally, I will engage with the regulation school and, in conclusion, proposing some very sketchy outline of how we could deal with that. So, engaging with the conjuncture. Engaging with the conjuncture, we can begin by the quantitative side. And the quantitative side is this one. Right? This is the idea of a capitalism that is aging, as we say, Mandel, is losing some forms of dynamism. And you can see the trend for the G7 country in blue. So growth is slowing down since the 80s very markedly. But that's also the case in China. It's of course later, but the main source of the dynamism of global capitalism is also losing steam in the past 2 decades. And that's the red line. But what I think we need also to address is not only the quantitative side, but it's also the qualitative side. And this is the core idea that we have in traditional structuralism, and this is also the root epistemology of the regulationist schools. You, of course, know this famous quote from Althusser: the complex school has the unity of a structure articulated in dominance. But what that means that there is one aspect that is dominant, that this dominant aspect gives its unity to the whole, and that qualitative changes are in fact a changing hierarchy between institutional forms. So the issue of the vacant throne is what could be the dominant institutional form in today's capitalism. So that's the question. And it has been in the past decade, finance. So finance-less capitalism is an alternative way to talk about neoliberal capitalism, but this is this idea that since the 70s you had finance at the core of the capitalist system. And we can trace this financial supercycle through the category of marks of fictitious capital. So that's what I have done in the book published in 2017 in English. And we can follow up afterwards, and we see that there we have in main North Atlantic country this trend upward of the basic forms of fictitious capital, which are credit to households, to non-financial corporation, to their environment, and stock market capitalization. And we look at that as a share of GDP, and we see that trend that is getting up for most countries, but Germany. But you can see also something taking place toward the end. And if you look a little bit more into the detail, so I will not go into the number because that's not the core topic, but that just to give you a flavor with the color, this financial supercycle, in fact, runs through 3 main moments. One main moment is the 1980-2007, is the long financial expansion. And during that period, the various categories of fictitious capital expanded as relatively to GDP, in all categories, in all countries. After 2008, there is a big change. And in particular, what we see much more involvement of the central banks that help to propel a continuous stock market expansion of stock markets. So really, you have the state that is stepping in to allow to have a form of what we call a state-sponsored general Ponzi. This is the state that is allowing finance to keep its relative weight vis-à-vis the rest of the economy. However, as Suzanne de Bruynhoff, a specialist of monetary and financial issue, wrote in the 1970s, no monetary policy can abolish the economic causes of financial stresses. So there is a form of legacy of the 2008 crisis that has not been resolved by the intervention of central banks, if you want. And after 2020, what we observe is that we observe that this financial supercycle is in fact beginning to retreat in all the categories, but only one, which are US stock market, and US stock markets is mostly the story of tech. So this is really what's going on since 2020, and it's in large part due to the inflation that is relatively to the value of financial assets eating the financial assets. So we can describe in a very stylized manner this super cycle that is coming to an end now, if you want. The second main characteristic of the moment is that we have a new sector that is getting the hegemony. And of course, this is the tech sector. Just to go rapidly on that, you cannot see on the left, but what you could read on the left that was bigger is that in 2000, only Microsoft was an enterprise from the tech sector among the 10 biggest stock market capitalization. If you look 1 week away, 2 weeks away, among the 15 biggest market capitalization, there are only 3 that are 4 that are not tech enterprises. So you have really an hegemony of tech in the sense that the tech sector is the leading place where finance is accumulating. There is a bubble mood, and everybody noticed that. This week is a little bit turbulent, but nonetheless, this is the really driving forces of capitalist hopes. There is, of course, a third major characteristic that is linked to this issue of hegemonic transition. And Martin Wolf from the Financial Times 20 years ago wrote, Europe was the past, the US is the present, and China dominated Asia is the future of the global economy. And reading that almost 20 years after, it's really striking to the extent that it is true. Of course, China is really at par with the US in many dimensions right now, and how this hegemonic transition will occur is very uncertain, and of course it's very worrying to see the increasing militarization in that context, right? In that context, and that's here you can see the world military expenditure, and you see that there is a marked increase in the recent period. The Russian war, of course, is there, but the background is really this hegemonic transition between the US and China. And finally, of course, the last main fact is the ecological crisis. You probably know this very famous planetary boundaries figure. And I think that it's really expressing what ecological economist William Capp wrote in the 70s, that the current transformation of the environment are no longer the expression of a growing mastery of the world, initially, but on the contrary, a sign of a loss of this mastery. There is a sign of loss of this mastery. And this is a sign of loss of the mastery that is epistemic, but that is also true in many capitalist dominant actors. For instance, you have this quote from a member of the board of Allianz that explained that with global warming, capitalism, as we know it, ceases to be viable. Why? Because there is no way to make insure many transactions that are taking place and that are requiring insurances. So there is this idea of something that is really existential. So of course it's overwhelming, huh? And the issue is how can we try to understand, to handle those qualitative changes? What kind of knowledge could help us to navigate those turbulent times? And my first point will be that it will not be neoliberal theories. They will not help us. They will not help us. Why? Because contrary to what we may suggest, we may imagine, neoliberal theories are not proposing a way for individuals to act, to be able to take control of the historical moment they are living in. On the contrary, they are really depriving individuals from any kind of capacity to it. And I will just, here I mentioned this forthcoming book by Jacques Rancière about Chekhov, where he's discussing the issue of time, of the possibility to get some form of freedom. And he talked about the time whose servitude speaks son, where nothing can happen. And that's exactly the kind of time that mainstream economics is developing. Classically, that was the case. Marx wrote already in 1847 that for classical economists, capitalist relations are, quote, natural laws independent of the influence of time. There are eternal laws which must always govern society. There has been history, but there is no history, no longer history. So no future in that context. Neoclassical approach also are advancing some forms of kind of closed time. Neoclassical approach leads to a conception of time that renders dynamic a mere variant of statistics. In effect, a logical time which is not the expression of any real movement. So that was a criticism made by Aglietta in his 2000 book. And you have also that in current macro, for instance, in McHugh on book, you talk about natural rate of unemployment or natural level of output, which suggests that there is multi-qualitative that can take place. But there is something deeper than that. And the thing that is deeper is the victory of the Austrian. The victory of the Austrian. And probably you know this, maybe you know this text by Durand, that's at the end of the 90s, where he said that finally everybody agree with the Austrian. Liberal Keynesians, Social Democrats acknowledge that the Austrian won victory in their intellectual debate with central planners. And not only liberal Keynesian, but also in many other disciplines. In particular, so he was reviewing the book of James Scott, Think Like a State, and he said basically that James Scott is just mobilizing the same epistemology of Hayek without quoting enough Hayek. So that's the main critique that he's making to James Scott. And the basic point, you know it's the necessarily schematic model of social organization and production animating the planning, that it is inadequate to organize a set of instructions for creating successful social order. So that's really the impossibility to plan is something that is agreed among a widespread of scholars in economics and beyond. So what is the Hayek epistemology? Hayekian epistemology is really this idea that humans know less. Humans know less. There is this pretense of knowledge that socialist, Keynesian, neo-Malthusian attempts want to organize society, but also nature from the perspective of human control, the control of human will. And this is deemed to failure, according to Hayek. The market knows always better. The process of adaptation operates as do adjustment of any self-organizing system. So you have here this cybernetics idea that Hayek is mobilizing, which means that at the end of the day, the market is a super information processor and is much smarter than we can ever be. So we should rely on the market. And we can have this scheme to summarize the argument. On the one hand, we have fragmented information that is local and subjective. So that's the kind of thing that the market will be able to convey, but is also conveying not only fragmented information that is local and subjective, but also some forms of knowledge that are inarticulable, even for the individuals. They are tacit, we cannot really explain them, even to self-examination. That's also something that they are stressing, that individuals are not transparent to themselves. So, in fact, when they are engaging in the market, they are revealing more, even that they are able to reveal to themselves. So, these markets convey information, but it not only conveys that information, but also it confronts it, and through competition, it creates new information, new knowledge. This is a truth discovery process by competition. As a result, market processing is really producing suprahuman knowledge that is depersonalized, underestimated, but that is much more relevant, according to that perspective, than any form of human articulated knowledge. So this is something very concrete. And this epistemology is very concrete, and in spite of the big differences to some aspect between Fama and Hayek, they are agreeing on this core element. And you find, for instance, in this famous paper by Fama about efficient market, that in an efficient market, competition among the many intelligent participants lead to a situation where actual prices of individual securities reflect the information that is based both on events that have already occurred and the anticipated event that could occur, how they are anticipated. So you have already this idea that is taking place in core theoretical aspect of finance and, of course, informing finance. And I would like to stress this argument concerning climate finance, because in this famous talk of 2015, McCartney explained that finance, in fact, was suffering from what he called the tragedy of the horizon. Finance was not able to anticipate the real risk corresponding to climate change. And what, in that case, he said that's a problem for central bankers because we need to deal with financial instability, and so we need to help financial market to better assess that risk. And the bottom line of his argument was saying that the more we invest with foresight, the less we will regret in insight. So his idea was to allow for financial market to better incorporate the ecological information. And in fact, that's the argument that has supported all the mobilization around the argument in favor of climate finance. And climate finance, in fact, it's really to create the idea to create market conditions that are more informed about climate change. So what the agenda of climate finance wants is to have nearly some markets that are able to process information that is really available concerning the ecological risk. And how you do that concretely? You are favoring disclosure. You are trying to favor disclosure. You are asking firms to disclose information, and so financial market will be able to process that information that cannot be processed by any government, any administration. But if the information is disclosed, then markets will act rationally. This is also the case in the context of tech. In the context of tech. So this is a figure from NICA 2025, where I explained that we used to have markets that were just in charge of allocation, with agents that are making their own valuation through trade. Then we had some markets that were information processors and that were able to generate information with agents involved that were strategically obfuscating some information, but markets allow to process that. And then we have agents that even know what are the true value, what they truly want, but in that context, digital platforms can, at the end of the day, can better generate information that the individuals can ever be able to articulate. The bottom line is that here is that agents are epistemologically compromised, so they cannot really make any rational choice. So we are going here to the idea of the wisdom of the cloud, from the wisdom of market to the wisdom of the cloud. And here you have the idea that with the computerization of huge amount of transaction, markets can be expanded, they can handle more information, they can generate more information, they can facilitate the transaction that would otherwise not exist. So really, the cloud and platform more generally is a way to increase the realm of market exchange. But that realm of market exchange is not a realm of market exchange that is spontaneous in any way. It's really a realm of market exchange that is designed by economist theorists. And here you have Albino Ross and Robert Wilson, very informative cross-interview in the Journal of Economic Perspective a couple of years ago, where they explain that with the increasing of the proportion of transactions that are conducted on those platforms, we are entering in a time when market participants themselves may be designed. So we move from market design to a new context where we will design market participants. So now going back to what was thinking Jameson, computers are enough to take care of totalization. That's this kind of project that is taking place now. We have an infinite complexity of production and exchanges at the global scale. This is not really, we are not really able to resolve that, but mysteriously it is resolvable inside the computer's black blocks, and it no longer needs to be dealt with conceptually. So in that context, we are really tracing some forms of economics that are disempowering people, and that are disempowering us in the sense that we have no way to engage with the kind of challenges that we face. And by insisting on the wisdom of markets in areas such as finance, climate, and tech, the prevalent forms of economic knowledge are debilitating our capacity to map the world and thus to act. And this is all the more shocking that we used to know that markets are building ignorance. Look at what Marx was saying in Capital. In bourgeois society, the legal fiction prevailed that each person, as a buyer, has an encyclopedic knowledge of commodities. So the main point here was saying that in the market, we were victim of ignorance in the daily transaction. That's also a point that was raised by Bettelheim, where he said that there is an absence of knowledge necessarily inscribed in the functioning of any market. Why? Because once you have market exchange, you release information to the price, and the other elements almost disappear or really are limited. The relation between different units of production in a way that is purely external. That's what I see. Okay, so in face of this inability of mainstream economics to help us to handle this, the various crises that we are facing, we have a new paradigm that emerged, and this polycrisis paradigm. So it comes from Edgar Morin and Anne-Brigitte Kern book published in the late 90s, where they said it's a paragraph that is entitled The Polycrisis. And in that paragraph, they say that it would be much better to be able to make a hierarchy of the various crisis problems. However, we cannot do that. We cannot find one problem to which all others will be subordinated. And there is a complex intersolidarity, and we cannot really move beyond that. And this is exactly the idea that was developed at a more popular level by Adam Tooze. And you know that we have this column in the Financial Times, and afterwards many other papers that were published, some websites that were launched. And the idea that we have shocks that are disparate, but they are interacting, and so that the whole is even more overwhelming than the sum of its parts. So the polycrisis is more than each crisis, if you want. That's the idea. And you have a combination of federative systemic risk with the potential to cause a cascading of failure, etc. So I think that this is a symptom of this idea of polycrisis. This is a symptom. This is a symptom that we need some forms of totalization. We need some way to think about the historical macro conjuncture. And that is a proposal that is made here. So what is the logic of the polycrisis? There is a logical entanglement of the various crises that are three main channels. One is common drivers. For instance, when Russia's war on Ukraine shocked both world energy and food system. So there is one event, but it is affecting various dimensions. Another idea is the idea of domino effect. One crisis in one dimension is cascading on other dimensions. So for instance, when the COVID-19 pandemic generated supply chain shortages, and then the need for fiscal stimulus, and both of them contributed to the inflation factor that took place in the 2022. And then you have the idea of vicious circles. For instance, when violent conflicts detract the attention about the climate action, and more climate crisis is more conflict, it's more war, less ability to tackle the ecological challenges. So this is the kind of analysis that you can build using that framework. At the bottom line, this idea of polycrisis has been formulated by Morin in the late 90s, but it was already there, if you want, in 1976, when he wrote that we live in society very complex, with such a complexity that there is a great deal of instability and disorder, up to a point where we cannot ask if we are living in a constant crisis. And I think that's also what is at the bottom of the idea of polycrisis. Is that it's very complex, so that complexity generates a lot of instability, and the polycrisis is a permanent crisis. And I guess that probably you will agree with me that a general and constant crisis is not a really helpful concept, because so there is no crisis anymore if it's a constant crisis. It is not a crisis in the sense that it's not an interregnum between the various set of stable relations, but it's something that is just an inconsistent evolution, if you want. It's also something that is problematic in the sense that it doesn't help us a lot to understand what is taking place. And there is a recent piece by Scylla that makes that point, that rather than making sense of the crisis, the polycrisis not a crisis of making sense. And I think that I like this way of framing the argument, because it just nurture, it's an expression of the feeling of being overwhelmed by crisis. And in that sense, we can think about the polycrisis as an epistemic crisis. So the idea that le signifié s'est évanoui, la chair du signifiant ne trouve plus le signifié qu'il a parcours, nous dit Deleuze. So what would that be in English? I'm not sure. But what should be signified is not there anymore. We just have the place of the meaning, but this place of the meaning is empty of signification. And I think that's also a way to think about the kind of political disorder that we have today. Aren't we living in a polycrisis in the sense that we have a form of pathological mapping? A mapping in which we are not really able, we have an empty way to look at ourselves, but that doesn't really make sense. And this generates a lot of defensive political responses, even, of course, reactionary responses. So that will be, if you want, the paradox of too much indeterminacy that is corresponding to this idea of polycrisis. So let's try to look at what could be an alternative to that. An alternative to that is what I propose here with this idea of reloading the regulation school perspective. So maybe to give some context, the regulation economic school has been developed in the 70s and in the 80s, mostly in France, but in dialogue with, in the US, the social structure of accumulation. So that's also something that is a little bit international. And that's a way to articulate a post-structuralist perspective on the economy. And the main scholars in that field were people like Michel Aglietta, Robert Boyer, that was also one of the theoreticians of the financial-led capitalism, people like Bob Jessop also is related to that tradition. So Alain Lippietz. So there are more or less 10, 15 scholars that are working in that context, mostly in France, but also a little bit in Japan, Germany, and the UK. And this perspective took at the beginning this idea of structuralism, that structure is unity. And I think that's a very strong point, but that's, as been by Vacant, of course, the idea of unity as the most important and characteristic trait of structure. So this idea that we need to think unity, we need to think about that. I think that it's a crucial idea. That is also a reason. The reason for that is that it's also something that is not disconnecting from practice. And this is also a point that has been made by Deleuze and maybe not that much underscored, that structuralism is not only a way to create an understanding, but it's also a practice related to what it is interpreting. And in that sense, the regulation framework is really wanted to handle a way, find a way to handle unity, but also to mobilize that to more practical aspect of political economy. So it proposed, I mean, the first and most important book is the book by Michel Aglietta. It has been edited several times by Verso. And in this book, Aglietta advanced an historical approach to capitalism, in the sense that there is a dynamic character in his analysis of capitalism, where the constitutive relationship of this system have a logic of internal transformation. But by transformation, and here is the key point, by transformation is not looking at some from plastic deformation that you can map qualitatively. That's not the idea that something is going up or something is going down. That's not exactly that. The idea that he has is that we should be able to find transformation as a rupture, as a qualitative change. That the idea of rupture is something that is very crucial. So we have capitalism, but we have various moments in the history of capitalism, and those moments in capitalism are really separated by a distinctive logic. And we need to handle that logic, to think about that logic. That's the main proposal. So if you want to read just one piece about the regulation school, look at this paper by Alain Lippietz, 1980, and that's something like from the regulation school, from the Althusserien to, or the rebel son of Althusser, that's the title of the paper. And it's a very nice paper because it's really engaging with the structuralist tradition, but also departing from that perspective and explaining how and why. And he proposed that the idea of regulation is a way to surpass the idea of reproduction by giving it more, allowing to have more contradiction, to have more agency. In the sense that what is regulating, this is the institutions that are allowing to handle, to contain the contradiction, but the contradiction do not disappear. They are here, people are acting, some are following routines, others are following, on the contrary, devariance, but those contradictions are really living contradictions, and the institutions are a way to contain those contradictions, but in the sense that they are compromises, social compromises. They are crystallizing relation of forces. But the agents are still here, they are still fighting, they are not disappearing, contrary to the Althusserien perspective, if you want. And in that perspective, the various elements of the structure, the capitalist structure, in a specific context, are various contradictions. So you have contradictions surrounding money, you have contradictions surrounding competition, you have contradictions regarding the wage and labor nexus, you have contradictions in the state. So you have many theories of those various institutions. They are like institutions, and and subjects are engaging in those institutions in a contradictory way. But the main point is that those institutions are able to contain this ability of capitalism for a moment. The miracle, if you want, is that capitalism should fall apart, but it's not falling apart. Why? Because you have those institutions that are able to contain, for a moment, in a fragile manner, the internal contradiction of the system. So these are the core concept of the regulation school, and maybe it's worth underlining against what they are theorizing. They are theorizing against the mainstream. I mentioned already neoclassical perspective, of course, but within the more heterodox perspective, they are against the frozen economic determinism of Marxism, the idea that there is a clear-cut devenir, technological determined devenir of capitalism. They are against also a catastrophic view of capitalism, for example, in the work of Durand. But they are also against the view of long cycle, something that is more linked to people like Mendel or to Carlota Perez today, that there are some wave of development that are linked to one another to some forms of trans-historical determinism. So these are the kind of things they are departing for. What they are arguing is that you have some specific modes of development of capitalism. You have some more particular forms of capitalism, and those particular forms of capitalism are the result of a combination of three things: a technological paradigm, a regime of accumulation, so a way the economy is allowing profit to increase and to be reinvested, and a model of regulation, which are the institutions that are organizing those two elements. And these elements allow them to propose a way to identify those modes of development in terms of what are their key characteristics, how they emerge, but they emerge as find. The word that is used by Libar is the idea of trouvaille. So it's not coming from anywhere, it's just something that is fine, and there is no logic in that. It's kind of an event, and around that event, a solution is found that allow this mode of regulation to emerge. And of course, those modes of regulation, those modes of development have internal tendencies to crisis. So that's the straight. And we can identify the rupture between the different modes of development. Great crises are marking the rupture between those modes of development. And the crisis of the 1929 and the 30s is one of the big crises. The 70s is one of a big crisis. I would argue what we are living since 2008 is another big crisis. So we are shifting from one mode of development of capitalism to another. And so contradictions are there, crisis tendencies are there all the way, always, but there are some forms of regulation that occurs. What is missing in that perspective? I will say that three main elements are missing. One element that is missing is the idea of capitalism, the problem with nature. This argument has been recently taken into account by Michel Aglietta in his last book. Michel Aglietta just disappeared a couple of months ago. And in his last book, he wrote, the more nature is historicized by capitalist dynamics, the more society tends to disappear. And I think that this is a crucial idea, and the idea that our transformation of nature, our way of engaging with nature and making it part of history, our way of historicizing nature, means that in the meantime, we are reducing the space for society. This is a key stage, and he elaborates some theoretical element on that. A second element that is relatively weak in the regulation school's perspective is the idea of international. And here I think that the theory of uneven and combined development of Trotsky is one of the most interesting ones. In fact, that's the idea that has been developed also by Gerschenkron. Gerschenkron, it's the same idea. The idea that with backwardness, you have some specific forms that are taking place. So on the one hand, you have the wipe of external necessity, and think about the transformation of China. The pressure of external dynamics, it constrains the Chinese to reinvent a new way, but the way you are changing, coming from a specific historical condition, is that you are making some forms of leaps, and you are discovering some new forms. And the idea of combination is exactly that. you are mixing some past forms with some very modern forms. And this idea of specific amalgamation through the pressure of the international is something that is not very well incorporated in the regulation framework. And finally, I think there is an idea that is very important, is the idea of aging of capitalism. Capitalism is aging in the sense that there is one dimension that is changing all along its whole history, is the fact that it is more and more socialized. More and more socialized in the sense that production is more, we are more and more dependent one from the other for everything that we are doing. Think about what is the number of people that were involved in one way or another to all the things that are in this place right now at that moment. It's much more than that would be the case 50 years ago. We have this deepening of the international division of labor, division of labor in general. That means that we are more and more socialized in the way we are consuming, producing, etc., etc. But it's also socialization in the sense that we have more and more organization. Organization with big firms that are bigger than ever, but also with the ability to control beyond the limit of the firms. And that's all the discussion concerning global value chains in particular. And also, of course, socialization of knowledge. Think about the role of AI right now, where we have this kind of automation of access to knowledge. That is something that is expressing this very specific form of socialization. So we had this idea in Marx at the end of book one, that the historical tendency of the accumulation process is socialization. And I think that this tendency is something that is very strong. Of course, Marx was very optimistic about that, saying that it will lay the ground for a socialist society, but it's not that sure. But what is sure is that this socialization is taking place and is main approach. So that was, if you want, my short presentation of this regulation good perspective. And right now, I would like to enter the last part of my talk by trying to take some risk in the sense of how can we think about this moment we are in and what are the kind of relations that we should be looking at. Here again, I'm relying on this fantastic text of Piquet's where he asks, he explained how we can analyze a conjuncture. So how can we analyze a conjuncture? The first thing is to grasp what is a principal contradiction. And the second thing is to try to determine the state of that principal contradiction. In the sense that under which modality this specific contradiction is determined by other contradiction, other conditions, if you want. And those other determinations are of two styles, if you want. One is the idea of displacement. So there are some forms of non-antagonistic contradiction. So there could be some quantitative variation in the same configuration, if you want. Or you have some forms of antagonistic contradictions that lead to fusion, and in that case, you have a kind of new combination that is emerging. So you have qualitative change. So what is the current configuration? A very stylized way to represent that current configuration is the idea of the domination of finance, finance dominance. So we have finance, that is the main constraint exerted on the system, that is disciplining state, for instance, through the debt crisis in the global south, or through austerity policies, but finance that is also exerting a lot of pressure on the productive sphere, on the consumption sphere. So on the production sphere, that's all the restructuration that took place in the 80s and the 90s with, all this downsize and distribute, layoff, mass fight against unionization, but also the globalization of supply chains that put a lot of pressure to that corporate restructuring, and also a lot of pressure to a competition that were fostered by finance, because financial actors, of course, can shift their investment from one company to another, from one state to another. And this hegemony of finance implied also forms of subordination of money to finance. The kind of money that we had was a money that was organized to guarantee low inflation rate and financial stability. So that would be the very stylized if you want, mode of development up till, let's say, 2008. Then we have this interregnum where we are in. And the interregnum where we are in is we still have finance, that is a dominant form, that is putting a lot of pressure on production and consumption, that is putting some pressure on the state, but it's a little bit more complicated. And especially it's more complicated. Why? Because we have the 2008 crisis. And after the 2008 crisis, finance was begging for support. Begging for support. It got that support from the state. And it was not only in 2008, but that was also in 2020, during the pandemic. And that was again in 2023 with the Silicon Valley Bank. So it's right now, in those days, we have also, if you read the financial news, you have some stop of the quantitative tightening by the Fed to support some corner of the market that are more fragile. So really, through the central bank, the state is supporting finance. And in that sense, the hegemony of finance is still here, but it's not like it was. Right? It is really depending on this new kind of relationship that has been built with finance. And also we have other elements. We have in particular the rise of tech, that is emerging from the production and consumption realm, something that is not fully clear. But everybody agrees that's something that is very important. And we have the ecological crisis with some forms of historicization, politicization of nature after, for instance, the Paris 2015 agreement and some kind of green policies that are, green agenda that is growing a little bit. So this is this kind of interregnum that we are in. How can we move from this interregnum? One scenario will be tech dominance. And tech dominance, that will be the idea that the tech will be finally taking more or less the power over the state in many dimensions. And this is something that we are, so this year is really, in the US, it's really a moment that where we are seeing a lot of things going into that direction. Think about the fact that on January 20, first day in the White House, what has decided Donald Trump was to suppress the regulation of AI by the federal state. So that's first day in office, that's what he took as a decision. Since then, there has been many decisions going into that direction. In particular, the fact that in the army, you have a new corps that is directly connected to the main top manager of the tech sectors. You have, of course, the Doge agenda. We don't really know how the data are circulating, what's taking place here. So really, you have many dimensions of state capabilities that are right now contaminated to some extent by the tech sector. And it's not only in the US. In Europe, there is a lot of debates around the issue of digital sovereignty. Why? Because the French railway system used to have its own cloud, and since 2 years, its cloud is an Amazon cloud. All major banks have their clouds managed by US companies. That's not only that. You have also, for instance, the Ministry of the Interior of Germany that signed just 1 year ago an agreement with Amazon for its own proprietary cloud. So crucial capabilities of the state or crucial aspects of the economy are really right now controlled by a US company in Europe, with all the discussion about weaponization of infrastructure that are taking place. Maybe you remember that in the context of the war in Ukraine, Musk threatened to shut the access of Ukraine military to its satellite and communication system. So this kind of blackmail could occur, and that, of course, is nurturing a lot of discussion concerning sovereignty. So fragilization of the state in the US, but beyond, by this hegemony of tech. But that's also, so on the production and consumption, that's also something that is crucial. I just mentioned that many private companies are now using more and more cloud services. In fact, all the big companies are using them. And the bill of those cloud services is only rising. So you have a kind of dual strata of the economy that is emerging, with one that is dominated by the data economy and the other that are paying income to that realm. But I think that one crucial aspect, and where maybe it's more crucial, the way we are seeing what's going on, is the issue of money. Because what we are seeing now is a kind of, I would say, a pseudo-crisis of the dollar. There is slow diminution of the international value of the dollar. You have also many foreign reserves that are moving out of the dollars into other form, golds or other currency. But you have also all the debate surrounding stablecoins. And stablecoins, Vacant thinks that it's a good trick to maintain the hegemony of the dollar because that will create a form of demand for the dollar. But in the meantime, it will generate a lot of instability. And we know that there will be a form of plurality of money, and not all the stablecoins will be reacting the same, so that will generate instability. And my guess is that once that stability will occur, we will see that some stablecoins are better than others. And at that moment, that will create a kind of more enduring plurality of money. Think in the context of crisis surrounding stablecoins, if Amazon is creating its own stablecoins, since Amazon is controlling a vast space of transaction, your stablecoins in Amazon stablecoin will still be usable. So the currency will not affect really Amazon. So in that context, I think that that could be a way to see this kind of contamination of the money, the tech sector, the money by the tech sector, and this is really something that will change meaningfully the configuration. So that's basically the hypothesis of tech dominance is what I have explored in the book published in English last year, this idea of techno-feudalism, where we have general digital dependency, not only you, my brother, but also firms and states, where we have a form of private seizure of polity. That's not only a social network, but that's also key aspect of state power. And we just discussed this idea of tech control over money. But that's also the idea of a predatory game, where you have a lot of investment, but that investment is dedicated not to produce, but to control. And in the meantime, in the rest of the economy, you have stagnation. And I think that if you are looking at what's going on now, you have a huge amount of investment in AI, but the rest of investment in the economy is very sluggish. So overall, there is no, we are not in a booming investing economy. It's really something that is completely disarticulated. So that's the first option that I explore. I will explore only a second one. There are, of course, you can imagine, you can play with that the way you want. That just to enter into that grammar, to suggest that for you to write, to work with. The second will be surrounding the idea of planning. And here, the idea is that nature should be historicized, politicized via the state. So I don't want to think about the state in a narrow sense. That's not necessarily the national state, that's the Estado Generale, as Gramsci would say. So that state plus civil society organization plus. But the idea is that nature should be transformed in something that is articulable by our society through basically economic and social accounting. We should have some forms of ecological accounting that allow us to handle differently our relationship to nature, to rebalance the social nature and metabolism. And that means that could be done via planning. So various dimensions. I just mentioned this idea of accounting, and if you want to have a permanent inventory of nature, that will of course not be exhaustive, it will be always imperfect, but we need to know as much as we can of nature to try to handle to mitigate what we are doing on the biosphere and to reduce our footprint. You need to rely on the kind of technology that we have developed in many senses. But how do you plan? How do you plan in an economy that is very complex, in which, of course, money is here? And so we have a lot of experiment on that. And that's basically developmentalism. Developmentalism, it's mostly credit policy. So that's some forms of quantitative control of credit according to priorities that will be politically determined. And here you have a forms of fusion of money and finance, but under the influence of the state. And in that process of both, on the one hand, credit policy and on the other, ecological accounting, you can transform production and consumption according to the requirement of nature or stabilization of the social natural metabolism. So this is what we have explored in this book with Razmik Koshenian. with the idea that there are three main planning devices. One is the ecological accounting that I just mentioned. The second one that is the matrix calculation of lifestyles. Basically, that's how we can make some scenarios in order to respect ecological boundaries, but in the meantime, there are various ways to do that. So we need to deliberate about those matrix calculation of lifestyles. And basically, that's a lot of work based from the economic point of view on input-output modeling, but also more narrative work from social sciences to figure out that. And the main tool will be from the deployment, if you want, of the planning apparatus, will be the function of socialization of investment that can take the form of both credit policy, but also some forms of more direct public intervention, such as public services or public ownership. And I think that, and I will like to end by that, by going back to those structuralist and that regulationist tradition, because those people, Aglietta last year, Abalibar right now, that are really at the end of their career and that have been working for 50 years, they are really engaging with that issue, and I think in a very inspiring way. And what they tell us is that we need a form of historicization of nature by nature, in the sense that we should allow nature to become a social actor governed by its own rules. And what that means concretely. And I think the way Balibar expressed that is very clear. We have to, there is no other choice. We must speak both for ourselves, the humans, but also for non-human actants. We need to speak for them, ask the question, provide the answer, interpret the signs that constitute their act of resistance, of counter-destruction, pandemics, mega fires, floods, and we should imagine the strategy to which we are exposed depending on their interaction. So I would like to stop here, and I thank you a lot for your attention.
So yeah, we'll take questions now.
Yeah, thank you very much for the talk, Professor Durand. Super interesting. I was just kind of curious. So it seems like your talk that you sketch out does a really good job at kind of treading a line between what seems like a really strong version of the Thusian polycrisis thesis, where we can't speculate too much about the next cycle of capitalist accumulation, because we want to maintain some kind of openness to the future, and we don't know what's on the way ahead. But you also don't want to go into the Rigi, hegemonic cycle and just read straightforwardly off the fact of American financial decline, the rise of the Chinese hegemon. And I was kind of curious about that in the light of your conclusion about the interregnum. And I was kind of wondering how geopolitical competition, especially rearmament, fits into that. So one example, you had Mark Carney when he was governor of the Bank of England earlier. He just released his first budget today, earlier this week for Canada. And most of that is cutbacks on climate spending to fund defense. So I'm just kind of curious about that general, geopolitical superpower competition and how it fits into your account. But yeah, thank you.
Do you want to answer them one at a time?
If there are another one, maybe I can take two, but I can begin with this one.
I just wanted to, I know you talked about in one of your slides about how there are certain forms of centralization that still sort of happen within the wider context of decentralized sort of capitalism. I wanted to know your thoughts on sort of how does sort of what I'm about to say, how does that fit into your dynamic of what you talk about in these slides? Sort of the fact that I don't know, I see corporations as their own form of centralization. So within the larger context of a decentralized, hyper-capitalist economy, corporations themselves and the authoritarianism of corporations in part comes from the fact that the instability of the wider decentralization is then combated by corporations using centralization. So corporations themselves are highly, highly centralized in an authoritarian way. And I just sort of wanted to know how that sort of fits into the dynamic of what you discussed.
Thanks a lot. Donc, regarding the first question, so I was really hesitating to build a third scenario around war and stuff like that. And I even have a slide with another form of the interregnum, where you have China that is a real issue. But here it's not working very well. Why it's not working very well? Because that means that here I was representing the US, and that's not really what I want to do. And so I skipped that, and I just, because I was sure about the question, so I keep it here, but I think that doesn't work very well. And I was also thinking historically. If you think about the various forms of regulations, it's not really an issue of some years. You can have major geopolitical shifts that, after all, will generate or are participating in new form of regulation. And what I have in mind is World War II, because World War II is after the competition regime that was taking place up to, let's say, the 1929 crisis, and then you have the Fordist regime that is forming afterward. World War II is a kind of this part of this interregnum. And I think that fossilizing this moment that we are getting through with all this tendency to World War and so on is misleading from the kind of framework that I would try to develop. So that's what I was trying to do. The second thing is that you can have another interpretation of the two schemes that I showed you. That in fact the tech hegemony could be a kind of degenerescence of the US forms of finance-led capitalism. And if the techs succeed in maintaining and deploying further hegemony at the world scale, including to dominate China in that perspective, that could be the dominant form afterwards. On the contrary, the green planning state is much closer to the Chinese model, so you can also think about that. But I don't want to overinterpret. That's really open to think. Thanks a lot for your question, and I think that's also something that is emerging out of those two models. Centralization is very. We are not living in a very decentralized economy. On the contrary, it's much more centralized than it was. There was this tendency toward monopoly in the post-war era with all those big corporations. In the 80s, with neoliberal policies, in particular with opening of foreign markets, there has been increasing competition, and that's true from a restructuration of the productive sphere. But since the 2000s, we are really observing a tendency toward increasing concentration. It's true in many industry, but more of all, it's really true regarding the role of the intellectual monopoly on the tech sector, which are some forms of gigafirms whose realms is extending beyond the narrow industry. And I think that's also one of the ideas of intellectual monopoly that is developed by various scholars, is that this is a very specific commodities that they are producing, and that commodities is affecting the way all other economic actors are acting. And in that perspective, this is an element of centralization, major element of centralization.
Yeah. So I have one very small another thing is I don't know if you would agree with this, but I think there is a bit of a I've always felt that there is a bit of a like a translation thing when it comes to regulation school, because in English regulation is very like univocal, it's like government regulation, but in this sense it's more like we're talking about regularization. We're talking about like the fact that, and this is the second thing I want to, or the proper question is that I think that maybe at the core is that the core insight is that there are these different factors of capitalism, and that the way they go together with each other, like labor power, or bourgeoisie, or ownership, or private property, should not be taken for granted, and that the way that they go together with each other is subject to variation, and that it's a problem to be solved for capitalism, that they even can go together in the first place, and I think like this is these what really stands out to me in the regulation school perspective is, for instance, concept like Fordism, which say, okay, so for instance, Fordism is something like the dominant principle of an era of capitalism in which it's like defined by rigid boundaries and disciplinary spaces and yada yada yada. And then there is another thing of post-Fordism. And in your schemas, there's more so a shift towards like pointing at, I mean, is this right? Like industries and like specific forms instead of principles. What would you say? Like, is how would you translate that? For instance, Fordism used to be a thing. What is our current principle? Like, what would define this world that's ordered by finance? Like, what principle regularizes everything?
There are other questions?
Hi, thank you very much. This is not my area of expertise by any stretch of the imagination, so forgive me if my question just comes out of a certain kind of ignorance, but I was surprised after I heard the talk to think about the title of the talk again. In part because it strikes me that it's not, tech isn't hegemonic or becoming hegemonic independent of finance. So I guess what I wanted to hear is a little bit more about the inextricable links between them that could produce, the combinatorial power of a new hegemony, but one that wouldn't sideline or marginalize finance, but actually, create new financial instruments, new forms of hedging, and you talked about this in relationship to the cloud to some extent. But as I'm reading the newspaper and OpenAI is kind of saying, no, we don't want a bailout, but they kind of do want a bailout, but they're not necessarily going to get a bailout. And that's all around their inability to grapple with having been overvalued in the context of, current market needs and their own desire to develop certain aspects of AI at the expense of other kinds of products. So I just wondered if you could give me more of a sense, since I know very little about either AI or finance, but it does seem to me that the title is a little bit misleading given where we are at the moment.
Yeah, maybe I think those two, and the one after, or third one. I'm afraid to forget one, but you will recall me. I'm doing my job.
Thanks. Thanks for the talk. This is just a question on your aside about Amazon stablecoins and crypto.
Yeah.
I was just curious if you could comment on the degree to which crypto or stablecoins threaten state sovereignty and establishing their own monetary policy versus the degree to which stablecoins require a sort of state-sanctioned monetary policy. How much is crypto threatening that, relying on that, retrenching that? What is that relationship? You posited it as a crisis of the dollar, but I just wanted to hear you elaborate on that a little bit more. Thank you.
Okay.
Would you like one more?
Last one, I cannot believe.
Yeah, I was just on the twos and polycrisis kind of question. I mean, I think reading polycrisis discourse as like kind of this symptom of an epistemic crisis we're inheriting from neoliberalism is like really sharp. And I'm definitely sympathetic with that reading. But I'm just thinking like if twos were here, like he would insist that, I mean, he's a dyed-in-the-wool like Keynesian economic historian, right? So he would probably deny very strongly that he's, hoodwinked or taken in by the neoliberal push towards decentralization for its own sake, because he's interested in larger models and sort of macro images of the totality. But I think the rejoinder would probably be something like, what makes more sense in the conjuncture we find ourselves in, tracking the kind of fragmentation and breakage and incoherence of what we see, or presupposing the, in a kind of inference, a deeper logic or uniting principle or some kind of conceptual foundation that links it all together, right? And so, I'm curious to sort of how you would respond to that.
Okay, well, maybe I can begin by the last one because I have in fact a direct response. since we had that discussion with Tools. So I met him 2 years ago in Roma. That was the first time I was playing with this idea. And he told me, I love your idea, but that's exactly where I disagree, because I don't think that you can find any kind of order. And he told me that those words that I like very much, he told me, I'm a dislocation liberal. So I'm running after one crisis after another, and we can handle them. It will be always difficult, but there is no other choice, and we cannot really have any more strategy. And I think that also makes sense, because he's intervening on the conjuncture in a very short term, and in that sense, there are all those crises that require some forms of intervention that could be invented, but there can be no other broader perspective. And I'm making the opposite argument that that's true, that there are those emergencies, but we need some way to think more in a longer term, in a broader term, something that is more stable to try to organize those intervention. And but yeah, that's a good question point. I will take those in the order. So the first question was about regulation versus regularization. So that I know that there is this problem of translation. I'm not the first to experiment it, but the various work in English that were translated as regulation school stuff. So I keep with the word, but that's maybe I should have underscored that from the beginning, that it's not regulation in the strict administrative sense that it is used in English, but it's really something much more deeper in terms of social regularization, as you would say. And thanks for underscoring that. The second point is, in fact, according to the other regulationists, they label the post-Fordist model as financial-led capitalism. So the equivalent of the concept of Fordism is financial-led capitalism. That has been modeled by Boyer in a very good paper in, I think it's in Economy and Society in 2000. And also, that was really the kind of work that was also doing Aguilita in that period. And this idea is that around finance, you have both disciplining elements vis-à-vis the firms, but also financial-led demand with a lot of debt, consumption debt in the US, or etc. So that's a little bit that will be the concept that will replace Fordism. I agree with you, it's not as nice as Fordism. Fordism was coming from Gramsci. It was much more interesting in the sense that it was better connecting to some forms of also technology, forms of organization of work. So all of that was lacking in the financial led, but that's where the state of the scholarship is at least. Then there is this big question, contest or not contest, between the various institutional forms. So maybe let's try that the idea of contest is to strategize too much those various institutional forms, like if they were agents that were fractions that were competing with each other. So we can, and there are a lot of forms of collaboration, of such support, that's what you are stressing, and that's of course very true. Even if there are some important divisions within finance. And we wrote with Benjamin Brown a piece for a Phenomenal World in spring, that was called The Brodelian Autumn of US Capitalism, about the various factions in finance in particular, and the fact, underscoring the role of private finance in advancing its agenda much more than mainstream finance in the current administration. And that private finance, which is politically much more active, is also very much linked to the tech sector in many aspects. So there are some fights within finance. There is also this book by Banquet about alt finance, Banquet and Bourgeon, that is talking about the various strands of finance. And I think that is inspiring. But anyhow, when I talk about contest, that's really not in strategic terms. And that's really structurally. I don't want to, I'm not making the hypothesis here that we have agency of those dominant forms. You have contradictions, you have agency of agents, but institutional forms are not agents. So what the idea of contest is here more, maybe a little bit metaphorical, but there is no agency. So thanks for helping me to clarify that point. Stable coins. That's the last question. Stable coins. To what extent the stable coins are threatening or contributing to the hegemony of the dollar? So that's a big debate. What the Vacant is considering is that, in fact, that's a way to enlarge and to sustain the hegemony of the dollar within the meantime relieving the constraint on external exchanges. So that's really this idea that it would be useful for the extension of the hegemony of the dollar. And most chartalist scholars will say that yes, think about also MMT scholars will say that yes, at the end of the day, all those stablecoins, all those crypto can only be used because there is the central bank and there is the state, and that's. I'm not that sure. I don't think that the ultimate legitimacy of money is the state. That has been the case recently, that's for sure. And there has been this, but I think the ultimate legitimacy of a currency is the fact that people are asking that currency because they can use it in a specific space of transaction. And that's the point where I imagine, that's not for tomorrow, but I imagine that the fact that you are allowing some forms of currency to be deployed privately in some private space, and then you will have some forms of crisis, but you will have uneven crisis, and that currency will be used much more easily globally than the state currency. At some point, you could prefer to hold your assets in a private owned currency than in the state. And at that moment, it's not sure that the hegemony will stay. So it's not. I'm not making a prognosis. First, there could be a new Democrat administration in 2 years, and they crack down on crypto, and bye-bye the cryptocurrency and so on. Who knows? But that's at the theoretical level. We can imagine this kind of plurality of currency with the strengthening of the dollar.
Yeah, and in one of your slides where you had the sort of more a positive future where I believe nature was the biggest circle, and then there's the state, and then okay, this one. Right, when you gestured to credit policy, you said, this is a return to developmentalism, developmental economics. I guess what I was wondering about with that is, right, like that kind of economic thinking comes from a very particular mid-century moment from states that kind of have a clear mandate to enact that kind of development, and also have sort of a clear constituency that they're trying to serve with that, or at least a sort of mass industrial class constituency that they want to create through that development. But so there's a political
threshold.
They have a mandate, right? And so I guess what to achieve this sort of ideal state of green planning, like what is the political constituency that this is meant to address? Who are the, I guess, hypothetical class actors that could achieve this? Like, what is the political moment now to do we have the political conditions now to enact some kind of developmental economic,
I'd like to follow up on Lisa's question about whether the dominance of finance has been supplanted by the dominance of technology. The other thing I heard you say that is a little bit different from that is that we're in an interregnum of some
Yes.
kind.
That's
to say the throne is empty rather than has been filled.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering whether you can address another question about the interregnum. Because what we are seeing, it seems to me, at this moment that you described as an interregnum, is actually a reassertion of the idea that both the dominance of finance and the dominance of technology involve the reavowal of both as being grounded in a reassertion of empire. In other words, there is an avowal in this throne of empire. And I'm wondering whether it makes sense to you to ask, something is changing, obviously. 40 years of financial dominance required the United States to disavow the empire on which its financial dominance is based. The idea was that we would rather than avowing our empire, defend Kuwait. Now we're saying that 50,000 Inuit are not going to become the next Kuwaitis just because they happen to be sitting on an ice cap, which is both oil and rare earth. Isn't the question not a question of the empty throne, but whether the joint dominance of finance and tech can survive the avowal of U.S. empire, or whether they depend on the disavowal of U.S. empire? Isn't that what appears to be seizing the throne at this point?
How many more do you feel you can take?
One more.
Okay.
So, 1, 2.
I guess, thank you again for this talk. It's been really interesting. This is sort of building off of the last question, because I guess part of what is interesting about the model that you're sort of presenting is the repoliticization of money for like the vast majority of people for whom it's been depoliticized and sort of treated in technocratic ways for this 40-50 year period we're talking about. And also that is the underpinning of like the contemporary US imperial infrastructure, is the sort of reign of the dollar. And it's, the fact that everybody's like international debts are denominated, anything, we don't have to go down the like rabbit hole there. But I guess I'm curious about your, there's so much question there about like where there are institutional levers that sort of control, like I think that people have gone back to the NIEO moment in the 70s, the sort of new international economic order that was attempting to be articulated through the UN at the time. But it also seems like the UN, given everything that's happened with Gaza and Israel the past couple of years, doesn't feel like it's a vehicle that people feel a lot of confidence in, not that any other vehicle is. But so I guess that's part of the question is like, where do you feel that there is some like credibility or like investment that people can bring to a potential repoliticization of like, investing in the world as a concept?
So, regarding the first question concerning the socio-ecological block, in fact, there are some research that are being done now trying to figure out if the various preferences of within the electorate can be articulated around a set of proposals with, on the one hand, support from welfare state policies, and on the other hand, some forms of full employment policies with strong green content. And I think that there is way to work about that, but that's of course not obvious. There are strong constituencies that are linked to the fossil fuel industry. I was in Mexico a couple of days ago, and I was talking with a taxi driver, and he explained me that it was a great president, AMLO, López Obrador, and Sheinbaum afterwards. Why? Because the price of oil was really low. And coming from France, where you had the unrest of the yellow vest when the price of oil trade, of course, this is very strong. There are some possibilities, but of course there are some stronger difficulties. And I think the main way to move forward is in fact to invest first in the green and then to adjust the price system. And the liberal response has been what has been called by Gabor and Weber, this green shock therapy. So you raise the prices, of course the impact is highly perceived, and then you have a backlash from popular classes because they are suffering from the cost of the green transformation. While if you are moving the other way around, making the investment, greening the way of life, at that moment you can adjust the prices ex post, and that would be a little bit the idea. But of course it's huge work. But I think that in that sense, the Chinese relative success in terms of greening its economy, with some, I don't know very much about China. It seems that the level of discontent, of course, is very much managed, but there are some support too. So there are some scope for greening of the developmental process. So the idea of the interregnum and the reassertion of financial power and technological power through imperialism. So I will say that yes, my first response will be that yes, there is something like that, and maybe using a quote from Brian Dees, that was former chief economist of the Biden administration. He said something like, there is no market solution to the rise of China. And then you say that there is no market solution to the rise of China. That means that you have some state-led solution to the rise of China, and that you will protect financial sector and your tech sector via the state. And finally, the Trump administration could be just a radicalization of that. But in the meantime, the financial sector, and too has been underscoring that many times, was very hostile to the increasing infighting between the Chinese and the US. Why? Because they are managing to get some opening in the Chinese market with their product. They are heavily connected to that. And even the tech sector, that's not completely obvious. Microsoft is super heavily deployed in China. So I think there is a rivalry between the US and China for sure. The tech sector is more or less aligned right now with the US. But there are also strong opposition to that agenda that cannot be spoken openly, but that is in fact also putting pressure on the Trump administration to reduce its hostility to China. So I think that we cannot reduce the nationalist agenda of Trump and the revival of imperialism to a direct defense of the tech and the finance administration. Being a little more into the detail, I think that the financial sector would be hostile to that kind of agenda. And in fact, was much more in the other part of the political spectrum. The tech part could be more open to that because and that's what you were stressing, and I think it's very true, there needs some kind of material basis. And that material basis are access to rare earths, access to develop some forms of engineering, and so in that sense, they are supportive of some forms of renationalization of production. So my response is not really helpful, I think, but I give you some points. But at the end of the day, I will make the answer that I made at the beginning. I think that this geopolitical confrontation is very important, but it's not telling us what kind of mode of development is emerging beyond that. So there is this moment of militarization, but I think there is a beyond that moment, hopefully. There is a moment beyond this moment of polarization that is also in the building, and I may be trying to emphasize that more. I like very much the way you frame your question about a place to invest in the world. That was your something like that. So coming from Geneva also, there is that's a huge crisis in Geneva. Thousands of people lost their job. My partner lost her job, and so on. But that's a moment where we are feeling in that specific part of the world very strongly the impact of the cuts on the international cooperation that is made by this administration. And of course, the UN is in a huge crisis of finance, crisis more than that in terms of project, and in terms of ability to articulate any kind of agenda. And I think that's, of course, very worrying. And in particular, one of the key institutions that we are collaborating my university kind of a lot with is the UNCTAD. And the UNCTAD is the place where this new international economic order was articulated in the 70s. And that's clearly a lost golden age. There is nothing close to that right now because there is no confidence, there is no strong alliance. So really, I have not a lot of positive things to say about that. I had some positive instinct during the spring. I saw that, okay, the Trump administration was going so hard in various dimensions, including vis-à-vis Europe, that finally you will have a kind of momentum in Europe. The various countries coming together to have a minimal progressive agenda, considering the hostility of the Trump administration, making some opening to China, to the global south. But after summer, all those hopes completely disappeared. Van der Leyen just accepting whatever wanted Trump. There has been no resistance. That has been a kind of humiliation for people in Europe. So maybe that will change, but for the moment, there is no good place to articulate the international. There is the US pressure, and the other side, there is Chinese that are building their alliances, and it's very strong, spread very strongly in the global south. In many areas, they are kind of cheap, but a place to think for the world. I'm not completely sure. Maybe the plan of the Chinese, if you read what they are writing, it's in fact you have the same idea in the Jameson Archaeology of the Future. I don't know if some of you remember. Jameson, he spoke about Brodel and the idea of the archipelago. And the idea of the archipelago is this idea that you have some forms of connection without value. So you don't share any kind of value, you don't share any kind of norms, but you have concrete material interdependencies that you mediate, negotiate, but without political content, if you want. And it seems that's the agenda of the Chinese. So if it is this kind of agenda, that's not the agenda of the UN, where you have some kind of value that could be said, you have some forms of law that could be made at the international level. So it's, but I don't know to what extent it is kind of implying or not. I'm not very sure.
Well, thank you. All right. Well, let's